We have two speakers in this session. Our first speaker will be Banu Bargu, who works in the Department of Politics at the New School in New York. Her main area of research is in political theory, and especially modern and contemporary political thought, alongside political anthropology, and also with a regional focus on the Middle East. Thematically, her work is focused on theories of biopolitics, sovereignty, and resistance. She's published widely in many journals, and she's also the author of a forthcoming book from Colombia entitled Starve and Immolate, The Politics of Human Weapons. And Banu will speak on Machiavelli after Althusser.
Is this good enough? Can you hear me? Closer. How's this? Okay. Thank you, Peter. So thank you for persevering to the last 100 meters of the Machiavelli marathon. At the end of Machiavelli and Us, Althusser salutes Machiavelli as the greatest materialist philosopher in history. Machiavelli, he posits, is the equal of Spinoza, who declared him acutissimus, most acute. But he quickly adds, and I quote, Spinoza considered him acutissimus in politics. He would appear not to have suspected that Machiavelli was also most incisive in materialist philosophy. End of quote. Formulated thus, what appears as an assertion of the parity of importance of both figures turns out to affirm Machiavelli's indisputable, though unrecognized place in the history of philosophy. In positing Machiavelli on par with Spinoza, Althusser redefines him as a materialist philosopher. Further, by evoking the inadequacy of Spinoza's appreciation of Machiavelli, limited as it was only to politics, Althusser also insinuates that Machiavelli is not only most incisive in materialist philosophy, but in effect the most incisive materialist philosopher, whose importance went unsuspected or unrecognized, or at least not fully recognized, by the greatest minds that came after him. This is a claim not to be taken lightly, if only because the same Althusser, rejecting the charge of structuralism, confesses to being, and I quote, guilty of an equally powerful and compromising passion, end of quote, that of being Spinozist. Explaining this passion, Althusser clarifies, and I quote, we made a detour via Spinoza in order to improve our understanding of Marx's philosophy. To be precise, since Marx's materialism forced us to think out the meaning of the necessary detour via Hegel, we made the detour via Spinoza in order to clarify our understanding of Marx's detour via Hegel. End of quote. While the Spinozist road traversed a significant distance toward understanding the mystification of the Hegelian dialectic, as he put it, such as the telos inherent in the negation of the negation, contributed to a theory of ideology, and helped construct a conception of immanent causality to account for the relation between the parts and the whole, Althusser nevertheless questioned the sufficiency of the effort. He asked, is it enough to get rid of them, the mystifications of the Hegelian dialectic, in order to introduce the materialist dialectic of Marxism by a simple process of subtraction and inversion? This is not at all sure, because freed of these fetters, the new dialectic can revolve endlessly in the void of idealism, unless it is rooted in new forms, unknown to Hegel, and which can confer on it the status of materialism, end of quote. If the incessant search for new forms of the dialectic that would ensure its materialist character paved the path to Machiavelli, the journey was propelled by Althusser's admission that the Spinozist road failed to reach the desired destination. This road was a path burdened by a shortcoming, the absence of contradiction in Spinoza's thought, whose effect was the neglect of class struggle in ideology and a certain theoreticism. Not a false path, but a detour, or perhaps a swerve, that in retrospect turned out to be necessary but not sufficient. Now, I will defer to the esteemed scholars of Spinoza among us to assess whether or not Althusser's self-critique regarding the Spinozist road is a fair estimation of the attempt to rethink materialism. But I want to emphasize that it was the effort to recover the elements of a materialism that neither had been inflected by the Hegelian dialectic, nor would be prone to lose sight of antagonism that seems to have taken Althusser to Machiavelli, with and through whose thought the new forms in which the dialectic can be rooted or anchored might be worked out, so that it would not revolve endlessly in the void of idealism. This swerve, however, that continued the journey in search of materialist philosophy in the late 1970s and early 1980s by passing through Machiavelli, was at once an advance, a new stop on the way, and a return home, an anabasis of sorts, considering that Althusser's earliest lectures on Machiavelli date back to 1962. Althusser's keen interest in new forms seems to have found a strong resonance in Machiavelli's thought, both in Machiavelli's self-proclamations about the originality of his own work, when he declares in the preface of the Discourses, "I have decided to enter upon a new way as yet untrodden by anyone else," for example, and should we hesitate to take Machiavelli at his word in the discoveries he makes on that path, which even if it had been trodden by others, did not seem to lead anyone to the same unknown lands and seas. This resonance finds expression in Althusser's strong assertion that highlights Machiavelli's novelty in the form of a solitude that remains unperturbed, not simply because he was, and I quote, alone in stating a new truth, but also, and more importantly, because no one has followed him, even imperfectly, despite Machiavelli's own statement in chapter 6 of The Prince that, quote, men almost always walk on paths beaten by others and proceed in their actions by imitation, end of quote. On the contrary, Althusser contends, Machiavelli has not been followed. He remains alone because, he says, no one has thought in his thought, either before him or more devastatingly, of course, ever since. It is this dual quality that Althusser attributes to Machiavelli that I would like to extrapolate and perhaps attempt to sharpen further as encapsulating the specificity of his interpretation among the vast literature that Machiavelli has inspired. Machiavelli as a theorist of the new, and Machiavelli as a new theorist. On the one hand, Machiavelli puts forth a theory of beginnings, the foundations of the modern state, a new political form. On the other hand, Machiavelli begins a new mode of thinking, a new method of theorization, which, if not inaugurates, then at least sanctions a materialist philosophy or a materialist position in philosophy with important political implications. Before I move to take up these two qualities in turn, allow me to elucidate briefly what new entails, since it is doing much of the theoretical work in distinguishing Althusser's discourse on Machiavelli. I quote Althusser here. Novelty can only repose on the surface of things. It can only affect an aspect of things, and fades with the moment that induced it. In contrast, the beginning is, so to speak, rooted in the essence of a thing, since it is the beginning of this thing. It affects all its determinations and does not fade with the moment, but endures with the thing itself. If one considers the thing which begins and is novel because it begins, before it there was something else, but nothing of it. End of quote. Thus, newness is not a superficial feature, one among others, that is bound to the fleeting temporal moment in which it arises. It is a constituent characteristic that travels in time with the thing it marks, imbuing it with a permanence. What Althusser therefore posits as new, he quickly qualifies. The new is both what stands in contrast to the old and what ruptures from it, what stands in opposition to it by its difference. In other words, the new points to both a diachronic shift and a synchronic opposition, one that endures with the thing and contrasts with the already existing or the old. Thus, the new is not what is novel, it is a beginning, an emergence, already antagonistically structured and structuring both what precedes it and itself as unprecedented. The new is Janus-faced. It is an advent, an arrival, which is at the same time the starting point. It is what marks a passage, but without passing. It arises as a departure, but it is carried along as part of what departs and differentiates. It has an originary positivity, but is already situated by antagonism. With these connotations in mind, I would now propose to turn to Althusser's interpretation of Machiavelli as a theorist of the new and a new theorist, and the implications of this dual quality. According to Althusser, Machiavelli advances a theory of beginnings. By disclosing the violent and conflictual foundations of the national popular state, he expounds a theory of primitive political accumulation, while at the same time articulating in broad strokes the complex relationship between force and consent that is crucial for the functioning and reproduction of the state once founded. Such a reading argues against the artificial polarity between the absolutist and the republican interpretations of Machiavelli's political theory, subsuming both as different moments in the problematic that concerns the founding of a state that endures. At the same time, it posits Machiavelli as a theorist of rupture, of a break from the political forms of the past, which are not commensurate to the task of creating national unity, as well as that of a break from the ideologies of the past, Christian theology, ancient political philosophy, as well as the humanism of Machiavelli's own times. This interpretation is important in several respects. First, it acts as a corrective against readings of Machiavelli that posit him as a figure of transition between feudalism and capitalism, according to a reductive Marxist reading, between theological politics and modern theories of sovereignty or a political theology, between Florentine humanism and the Enlightenment. In Althusser's interpretation, Machiavelli appears as a theorist of the new state form, not as the antecedent of modern sovereignty, but its pioneer, both its starting point and already its arrival, in antagonistic relation to the political forms that precede it. He comes forth not as a transitional figure between the medieval moral tradition of political thought and the philosophy of natural law, with which the bourgeoisie as the ascending class found its self-representation, according to Althusser. Rather, he stands as an exception, one that cannot be subsumed into what comes before, nor can be eradicated but by what comes after. Machiavelli's solitude, says Althusser, lay in his having freed himself from the first tradition before the second submerged everything. That is, in commanding the ability to articulate the violent birth throes of the modern state without reference to either an ontological predisposition to politics that tends to naturalize the state, or the bourgeois myth of the state's natural and lawful emergence from a state of nature that tends to neutralize the state. Althusser restores Machiavelli's originality without losing sight of his historicity, both in terms of his innovative ability to capture his own temporality in theory and his ability to do so without recourse to the philosophical traditions inherited from the past, indeed, by breaking with them. He does so, moreover, in a way whose newness does not fade or cannot be erased by what comes after. In a sense, he's even more ahead or advanced than his historical successors, as he presents a critique of liberalism's erasure or neutralization of the violent origins of the modern state, even before liberalism. Machiavelli anticipates Marx in the field of politics. What Marx's work does to the ideologists of capitalism, Althusser's expression, though after capitalism is already in place, after the accomplished fact, by disclosing the process of enclosures and dispossession, or, quote, the story of pillage, theft, exaction that underwrites the origin narrative, which consists in labor, thrift, and generosity, Machiavelli's thought does to the ideologists of the modern state. Put another way, Machiavelli's originality lies in the resistance of his thought to being subsumed into the liberal humanist ideology that rises to dominance after him, even as the phenomenon he theorizes, and which liberal humanism sanctifies, that is the modern state, becomes the prevalent and hegemonic political form. Consequently, Machiavelli does not only theorize a rupture, he is himself the rupture. His thought is the advent of a new era to which he causes embarrassment with his audacity by disclosing the real story of its founding. But this is only part of the picture. Althusser asserts that Machiavelli does not only theorize the new in politics, but also reconfigures the enterprise of theorization itself. This brings me to the second element of Althusser's interpretation, Machiavelli as a new theorist whose uniqueness lies in his ability to grasp the role of contingency in history and to theorize the singularity of each conjuncture, bringing political practice into the domain of philosophy. Machiavelli's new mode of thinking, according to Althusser, is revealed by a theoretical dispositive, which, and I quote, establishes particular relations between the discourse and its object, the discourse and its subject, end of quote. Such a formulation, of course, signals that we're entering a different terrain of inquiry. It is an evocation of reading capital, where Althusser puts forth a practice of reading philosophically, a practice which involves putting into question the relation of the discourse to its object, though not to its subject, and I will return to this. So what are the features of this dispositive? First is its epistemological status. Machiavelli's discourse is not science. True, it appears as a science of politics because of Machiavelli's explicit distanciation from imagined republics and commitment to go to the actual truth of the thing. However, Althusser insists Machiavelli's thought escapes the systematicity of a scientific discourse. His reflections remain fragmentary, contradictory, and without a unifying focus. In contrast to the definition of science advanced in Reading Capital, where there is no constitutive subject, or what is at stake is no longer the subject which sees, but a field that sees itself in the objects or problems it defines, Machiavelli's discourse retains a subject, or rather subjects, at first doubled and antagonistically posited in the metaphor of the mountain and the plain, but then multiplied in the possibility of subjects, undefined as they are, that are invited, or better, incited to occupy the empty space of political practice awaiting to be filled. But Machiavelli's discourse also differs from science because the concept of the thing does not dominate or subsume its concrete manifestations. A case is not taken up by Machiavelli as a particular instantiation of the universal. Rather, the exposition of each case drives what fragments of the universal will be called upon in order to shed light on that case. This is a strategic appeal to the universal, much like the way history is selectively utilized in the service of the present. Althusser maintains that examples from the past are not applied to the present when they're invoked for comparisons, but juxtaposed instead. Each time, it is the specific case that determines what of the universal and what of the historical will be marshaled strategically in order to illuminate it. At stake in this illumination is not an illustration or a demonstration, but by way of comparison, a distanciation. In other words, Machiavelli holds on to and actively cultivates an irreducible tension between a concept and the reality it is purported to capture. In this light, I would submit that in considering Machiavelli's epistemology as an antithetical one, as Balibar proposed yesterday, we should take into consideration not only the conflictual reality that he conceptualizes, with a remarkable fidelity that is neutralized by many who came after him as the precondition of knowledge, but also the trace of antagonism preserved in the relation between the concept and its referent. If my understanding is correct, each concept in Machiavelli, viewed through Althusser's analysis of his dispositive, has the paradoxical effect of deferring a final definition or statement on reality, as a consequence of which the ineradicable singularity of reality is privileged over the generality of the concept, to which it always remains in a certain distance. The second attribute of this dispositive, and to my mind, the key to what situates Machiavelli's reflections in the domain of materialist knowledge, separate from either positive science or perhaps ideology, lies in the ordering of his reflections for Althusser. The relation between different elements in the sequence of apparently contradictory theses is what uniquely constitutes Machiavelli's new mode of thinking. Althusser argues that the arrangement of Machiavelli's theses on history is such that, by way of consecutive contradictions, it proceeds to produce concepts that are not deducible from these theses themselves. So, a general thesis on knowledge, the immutability of the world, is posited in order to establish the possibility of objectivity as well as of conducting comparisons across space and time. But this thesis is posited only to be negated and further determined in the process of negation by the thesis of contingency, the continual motion of the world, which founds the basis of variations and variability. However, the contradiction between the two is resolved by reference to an apparent synthesis, which adds further determinacy. This is the cyclical theory of history, which combines the immutability of the world with change, but now according to forms of government. This is the third thesis. So far, one can only express surprise at this proto-Hegelian reading that Althusser has grafted upon Machiavelli. However, and this is the real mark of the Machiavellian procedure, the Polybian synthesis is posited only to be completely rejected in the fourth thesis. All governmental forms in the Polybian cycle are defective because they're either bad or not durable. And by a new negation, which Althusser calls a displacement, we arrive at something completely new, a shift in the definition of the object of knowledge from forms of government to a state that endures, an object which is also a practical political objective and which requires a practical solution, escaping the Polybian cycle by a mixed governmental form that promotes the longevity and grandeur of the state. To appreciate this operation, let us recall Althusser's exhortation in Reading Capital, and I quote, "We must completely reorganize the idea we have of knowledge. We must abandon the mirror myths of immediate vision and reading and conceive knowledge as a production." End of quote. But Althusser notes that in Marx's Capital, this operation remains trapped within a certain circularity. I quote again, "It is therefore a question of producing, in the precise sense of the word, which seems to signify making manifest what is latent, but which really means transforming, in order to give a pre-existing raw material the form of an object adapted to an end, something which in a sense already exists." End of quote. I only remark in passing how this passage alludes to Machiavelli's characterization of the most excellent princes, Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, and others, to whom fortune provided the matter, and I quote from Machiavelli, enabling them to introduce any form they pleased, chapter 6. In contrast, the dispositive in Machiavelli breaks the circularity of the epistemology, or the epistemological circularity posited for Marx, and does so in two ways. For one, by the sequentiality that produces a new concept that cannot be found in latent form, and second, by opening the final step of the operation to what one could call contamination by the real, where the theoretical object and the political objective, and therefore theoretical and political practice, converge, preventing the closure of the movement of thought. Machiavelli's method, Althusser argues, is the negation of the negation of the negation. In contrast to the Hegelian dialectic, where the supersession, the Aufhebung, preserves the elements that are negated in the higher synthesis, Machiavelli posits the synthesis only to be refuted and redirects the negation toward the production of something that did not exist before, a concept that can only arise or be produced by such sequentiality, but is ultimately irreducible to its anteriority. But Machiavelli does not stop there. He also opens the concept up to the challenge of its practical singularity, with which it always retains its antagonistic tension, its distance. I must emphasize that the formal structure of the sequentiality, which produces a new concept, as a possible new form of the dialectic that Althusser feared might otherwise revolve endlessly in the void of idealism, is precisely why I disagree with Morfino's formulation of the 5 theses in Machiavelli. You will recall that, keeping the first theses of immutability and contingency, Morfino then introduced 3 different theses: the primacy of the encounter over form, the interweaving of temporalities, and the disarticulation of history and memory. While each of these theses may indeed have their place in Machiavelli's thought, and therefore I want to register that my objection is less to the content than to the lack of linearity, or to the underspecified relationality in their ordering, in their presentation, that then the result tends to occlude the movement of thought that produces the concept, and opens it to challenge from the real. The thesis on the primacy of the encounter, for example, does not follow from the thesis of contingency, nor can we specify the relation between the ensuing theses on temporality with those that preceded them. Allow me to emphasize the sequentiality which Morfino tends to overlook with a different example. It is a curious fact that Machiavellian Us concentrates almost exclusively on the Prince and the discourses, and except for a brief reference to the art of war, largely omits Machiavelli's other works. The reasons for this decision are unclear, especially since the Florentine histories lends much support to Althusser's analysis of the theoretical dispositive as the mark of Machiavelli's new method of thinking. At the risk that my account will not be completely convincing in the absence of a full exposition, I want to highlight a series of theses that can be extrapolated, this time not on history but on politics, or both, from the Florentine histories. So, thesis 1, conflict or antagonism as the self-generating and driving force of politics, such that the periods without conflict are omitted from the narrative of Florence's history. At the same time, this conflict is not singular or homogeneous, but plural and heterogeneous. Their constituents are different actors, just as the content of the antagonism is extremely variable. could be from hatred, jealousy, interest, revenge, inequality, even amorous passion. On the one hand, there's the conflict between different noble families. On the other hand, there's the struggle between classes, the nobles, the people, the plebeians, the lesser people. But this is not exhaustive either. There is the conflict between the factions, the sects, the guilds, the individuals. Finally, there's the conflict between Florence and other cities, its external enemies. This brings me to thesis 2. The unity of Florence as the political objective, the performative horizon of Florentine politics. The city is at once a unity and simultaneously a force field crisscrossed by a multitude of antagonisms between individuals, groups, and classes. But Florence is also a performance because it is assumed and created with the explicit intention to forge a unity through multiple conflicts. So already we have a negation, conflict, with unity. Thesis 3. The contradiction between the first two theses is resolved by an apparent synthesis. Liberty is the unity of the conflicted, contentious city. Fear of outside enemies, fear of losing the liberty of the city is what ultimately forges unity with, in, and through conflicts and divisions. The history of Florence, then, can also be read as the successive attempts to externalize the internal antagonisms upon a foreign enemy in order to protect the liberty of the city and add to its grandeur while forging its unity, especially as laws and institutions prove insufficient in managing the same conflicts. So thesis 4. But the seeming resolution is quickly undermined by a fourth thesis. The unity of the city, or read its liberty, is becoming more and more difficult to maintain. The same history is also a series of mostly failed attempts to forge and maintain unity. There's a tragic element in the narrative of the Florentine histories. Despite the best efforts, there emerges a negative arc of corruption and decline, dispersion and dissolution, which culminates at the end of the book in the death of Lorenzo de' Medici. This moment is at the same time the displacement, which converges with Machiavelli's other works. In terms not as explicit as The Prince, though still present, the book terminates the narrative invoking the threat of ruin that beckons Italy, the impossibility to maintain Florentine liberty or unity in the current conjuncture, and the need to unite Italy, even in light of the very impossibility of the conjuncture. At the background, there is once again the Polybian thesis of the cyclical view of governments, against which Machiavelli casts the fluctuating history of Florentine constitutions, struggles, revolutions, and reconstitutions. But this immutability stands in tension with the contingency in history, the constant eruption of unforeseen events and conflicts. If Machiavelli's solution to the discrepancy between the two theses in the discourses is mixed government, as the form suitable for states that endure, the Florentine case further reveals the precarity of the solution, how it is constantly subject to contestation and remaking, and that its security is ultimately tied to the project of national unification. As a result of this procedure, and this brings me to the third distinguishing feature of Machiavelli's new mode of thinking, is the temporal orientation. This discourse is ultimately marked by futurity, the fact to be accomplished instead of the accomplished fact, as Althusser puts it. In other words, instead of past forms, arguments, concepts dominating the understanding of the present, Machiavelli's discourse is oriented to what is to come, neither as a teleological movement nor as a prognostic device, but as a discourse that precludes closure and termination. Because Machiavelli's thought is driven by politics, by a political problem, the sequentiality of the discourse cannot be halted until the solution to that problem in the form of a political objective is formulated. But formulation is not sufficient. It must be enacted. Since the introduction of a political objective into the space of theory already inflects that space, it is the realization of the theoretical solution in the world of politics that can only bring its closure. But since the problem is not simply the founding of a national popular state, but also making it endure, the problem is not open to a final resolution, either political or theoretical. Hence the porosity, open-endedness, and perhaps uncanny contemporaneity of Machiavelli. But here I would concede to Morfino regarding the plurality of temporalities within Machiavelli's discourse, namely that this openness to futurity does not mean that the past is wiped clean each time the new emerges, erupts as a natural catastrophe or revolution, or is introduced. Rather, the traces of the past are retained in language, in memory, sometimes only in name. But just like these become the substratum upon which the new is erected, so we can think of Machiavelli's rupture from the past as not completely annihilating what came before him, but retaining a plurality of times whose conjuncture can be generative of new encounters. Finally, this dispositive is also distinguished by its immense political implications. It undermines any claim to neutrality by openly adopting a partisan function, rallying the claim to truth, going directly to the effectual truth of the thing, as the very performance of truth itself. Truth is not an external point of view outside of the conflictual field of forces, but rather shaped in and through them, and becomes true to its name only by advocating for one side in the conflict, by lending itself to the service of political struggle as a weapon in that struggle. Let us note then, in passing again, that the concept of truth, too, retains a certain distance from the conflictual reality that it denotes in a partisan way. What Althusser names as, quote, the text that is an impassioned appeal for the political solution it heralds, end of quote, then simply obliterates the possibility of a purely philosophical discourse by advocating and indeed performing the performativity of theory. On the one hand, Machiavelli interpolates an agent to occupy the empty space of political practice, rendering itself a tool of that agent. On the other hand, situating itself within the field of forces that it theorizes, a text that argues for political practice and in fact stages an intervention that is a form of political practice, is constantly threatened by the political practice that penetrates, intrudes, makes incursions into, and drives the text, opening it up to the proliferation of interpretations and the impossibility of completely enlisting the text to one's own forces, or what Althusser calls the difficulty, quote, to enroll Machiavelli in one's own ranks, end of quote. It is the analysis of this dispositive which Althusser calls thinking in the conjuncture, but what I would further qualify as thinking by and through a distanciation that I think really marks the originality of Althusser's interpretation of Machiavelli. By way of conclusion, I would like to suggest that Althusser's interest in casting Machiavelli as a materialist philosopher cannot be considered in isolation from the attempt to rethink historical materialism in ways that break with the latter's teleological conception of history, flirtation with the moral ideology of humanism, and reductionist renditions of determinacy. In Machiavelli, Althusser found the contingency of history, the ineradicability of conflict, partisanship in philosophy, and a brave expression of the, quote, aleatory foundations of the current world, end of quote, we take for granted. When confronted with a question regarding the relationship between Machiavelli and the Marxist tradition, in the beginning of his lecture on Machiavelli's solitude, and if we are to take what Althusser says about beginning seriously, we should infer that this beginning is not a superficial feature that vanishes, but one that remains and continues to determine the vector of Althusser's reflections. Althusser qualified this relationship between Machiavelli and the Marxist tradition as one of coincidence and repetition rather than one of direct descent. I have tried to show that it was Althusser's attempt to recover what was lost in this aleatory repetition by going to the beginnings, following the path that took Althusser from Spinoza to Machiavelli. If Machiavelli used his examples of antiquity to create a distanciation from his own present? May we not consider Althusser's reading of Machiavelli as a similar attempt for us, recovering his memory, Machiavelli's memory, and inviting us to re-inhabit his position in philosophy? If Machiavelli's discourse hails the future concealed in the past, perhaps it is also possible that Althusser, speaking to us from the past and from a path less taken, may still have something to say about the future of materialist philosophy. Thank you. But he knew I was going to.
Can I reply to the next conference and the next No, I'm not sure to add the point of the critic to the thesis. Because I was not saying that there was a kind of sequence in the thesis. But for example, the third thesis was a kind of resume of the two first one, and you have to think the first and the second, and then the third together with. If you want, I've not retained the scheme of Althusser with the contradiction, and then the contradiction of the contradiction, and. But I need to read your text careful because it's...
No, but that is precisely my response in the sense that I agree with the content of what you're saying, that the primacy of the encounter over form, yes. But for me, the distinguishing feature is the sequentiality of the development that allows the negation of the negation of the negation. Whereas when what you put, as you just said, is a synthesis of two earlier positions, which confirms a kind of Hegelianism that Althusser's reading of Machiavelli tried to overturn.
You said that I was Hegelian.
Yes, in too many words. Now it's getting under the belt. Yeah.
No, okay. It's too
bad. Sorry.
You quoted Althusser, who said that what Machiavelli does is not science. And yes, it is not science in the meaning, in the modern meaning of science as the metaphysics of representation. But what if we consider other meanings of science? I'm thinking to, say, the actor network theory by Latour that constructs even politics as a field of forces reciprocally testing each other. Still in anthropology, if you think to the concept of thick narration of Clifford Geertz, it's very close to the project of the Prince. Or if we move to literature, we may even find a name for this science. If we borrow from Robert Musil, Robert Musil, Austrian writer, and he wrote about the science of individual solution that applies very well to what happens in The Prince. So what if we use Machiavelli as a non-modern narrative model to contrast, to produce a political theory that is demodernized, meaning that it's not caught in the systematizing approach of modern political theory?
Yes, I mean, when I say and when I repeat Althusser's argument that Machiavelli is not doing science, what he has in mind is the positivist science, as you put it, the almost metaphysical apparatus of representation that imbues positivist science. I try to conceptualize Machiavelli's difference as a materialist knowledge in order to avoid using the word science. But if we were to reconfigure the word science in this way, I'm happy to use it. I'm not afraid to call this science. But that's not my argument. It's not my. I'm not invested in what we call this procedure. But you did cite Latour, and this is interesting to me because actually this paper is part of a project for me on Althusser's various readings of political theorists as an intervention, my own intervention, to the contemporary discourses that are proliferating right now on new materialisms. And Latour, of course, is very influential in that literature. And I find that literature quite interesting, but also very problematic in the way that, as you expressed, obliterates politics. Has certain political implications, but really undermines, or at least under-theorizes, let's say, the political element that historical materialism tried to address. So I find Althusser relevant, maybe not completely correct or incomplete in so many ways, but still a potential contributor to that particular discourse that is going on today. And I find his reading of Machiavelli to be particularly relevant to that direction, to that discourse. No, well, okay, we can discuss that, but in some ways one can argue that he does undermine a more agential understanding of politics. In any case, in the political idiom that we are sort of used to understand. I mean, the introduction of non-human agents does not necessarily increase the agential possibilities of humans. But in any case, that takes us further afar from my paper today. But that's kind of the field of intervention that I hope to maybe obliquely address through Althusser's reflections on Machiavelli. Yeah.
One final question. Yes, just very quick. So let's take the idea of repetition seriously. So the Roman past, we assume, can be repeated in the present. Yeah? If that's the case, metaphysically speaking, then there is no past as past, because it's always present, so to speak. Yeah? That means that also the future as future is not real, ontologically speaking. Yeah? So what that means is essentially you're thinking actually subspecies aeternitatis, to return to Spinoza. Yeah? Now my question is, I think that's the right way. That is, that you cannot, Althusser cannot, and neither can Machiavelli, neither can anyone, when one thinks the beginning just the way you thought it, it has to have this element of subspecies aeternitatis, namely the past and the future have to be understood as illusory, fundamentally, right? The historical distance is an illusion. Yeah? If that's the case, then I just want to know, what do you mean by the future when you say, how do you interpret this to come of Althusser?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I don't know how to answer that. Okay, what I meant... yes, I agree with your formulation, although what I tried to express is slightly different in the sense that there are elements in the past that are not exhausted by having been left behind in their possibility. And so temporal futurity, let's say the next decade, if the conjuncture arises, if the conjuncture allows an occasion, it might be possible to reactivate or to extract that substratum and utilize it as a contemporary weapon. That was what I was trying to say. Althusser is trying to do with Machiavelli what I'm trying to do with Althusser in some ways. So yes, there is no past and future in the grand scheme of things, but if we thought in terms of mortal beings with a certain time horizon, only in that sense that I use the future as to come that can go back if necessary, to activate, to call upon, to bring forth the unrealized beginnings that remain, that are not fully obliterated by the accumulation of other new things. And in Althusser's interpretation of what comes after Machiavelli, the ideologies of the state that sort of erase that violent foundations that he so well theorizes. But that's a very difficult question. I need to think about the temporality dimension more. Thanks.
Just to avoid the illusion of progress, which always...
It's not about progress, no. Progressing. Thank you, though. Thanks. Thank you.